Hi, I'm Ansel Clancy, internationally certified arborist and acting board member for the Maui Coffee Association. I'm here today to teach you how to float mucilage coffee. Now, it's important to know what mucilage coffee is. This is the step in your coffee processing right after the wet mill when the seeds have been removed from the cherry. Mucilage is going to look like this. It's called mucilage because these seeds are covered with a sugary coating called mucilage. Now, it's important to note that floating this coffee is a process that's done within a method called washed coffee. There are three main methods of processing coffee. You have what's called a natural, where you dry your seeds inside of that red fruit or yellow fruit called the coffee cherry. You have a process called honey, which is where I would take this slimy mucilage coffee and I dry it with all that sugary mucilage on there. And thirdly, you have what's called washed coffee, which is where I'm going to actually float and sort this to remove some defects, but then I'm also going to ferment all of this sugar off of the outside of the seeds and rinse that away so that when I dry this coffee, it's incredibly clean with a low potentiality for mold. Okay, let's get to floating. Now that we're all set up to float, I've got my garden hose and I have my mucilage. So now we just fill our bucket again. Now, if you've been watching my video series, you've already seen how to float coffee cherry. If you're following along, we actually end up floating our coffee about 3 or 4 times. So I'm simply stirring this mucilage as I fill the bucket with water. I'm actually taking it and squeezing my hand to actually scrub it together. And that's about enough water. Now I'm going to continue stirring it and scrubbing it. And then what's going to happen is some of these seeds are going to float to the surface. As these seeds float to the surface, those have a lighter density than the ones that sink. If I left those lighter density seeds in the batch with the heavier ones, they would burn first in the roast, making an inconsistent roast and a defective cup of coffee. So floating is critical, and this is an easy way to grade your coffee. I want to get this nicely agitated, so I'm really stirring it up. Now I'm going to let it settle. Grab a little bucket from my refuse here. Now floating right on the surface of the water, I've got those light mucilage. So I'm just going to scoop them right off. As I float this, I'm actually going to do this same process over and over for just a few days, connected to another step called fermentation. The reason I'm fermenting this mucilage coffee is I actually want to remove the sugary mucilage from the outside of the coffee seed so that when I store this and dry this in the sun, it doesn't mold and it doesn't end up with an inconsistent moisture. So as I'm stirring and removing my floaters, looks like I've got them all out. Now, I'm ready for the next step of the process, which is called a fermentation. I'm going to let this sit right here. Oh, there's one more floater. I'm going to let this sit right here for about 12 hours. I want to keep the water around the mid-70s, and what will happen is the sugars in that water will begin to ferment. After 12 hours, I'm going to rinse this off. I'll lay it out on a screen and rinse off all the fermented water. That actually washes some of this sugary mucilage away. Then I reintroduce it to water again and I stir it up and I remove anything that floats. The following 12 hours, I rinse and repeat. I'm going to keep that process going every 12 hours, rinsing off the sugar water, re-inoculating a new fermentation, and removing anything that floats. Then eventually, after a few of those washes, this sugary, slimy mucilage is going to feel coarse, almost like a real fine grade sandpaper. Once it's coarse and you have a wash after 12 hours, when you come back, you're going to stir the coffee before you rinse it. And when you stir it and the water's crystal clear, you're done with your ferment and it's on to the sun drying racks. Okay, I'd like to do a brief recap with you of what you've learned. We've reviewed how to float mucilage coffee, how to wash your ferment, and how to get your mucilage coffee to a point that it's ready for sun drying in the process called washed process coffee. Happy processing.